This is not a survey show. The variety comes out of what Andy has been doing in the past year.
All this work is about the last 6 to 9 months.
Exactly.
30 years in development.
And that kind of follows what you and I were talking about before in prep, that this idea of fractals as a natural phenomenon influences you both practically and intellectually.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always looking to make paintings that really tread this line between pure abstract paintings and allusions to things in nature. And fractals interest me a lot because basically what a fractal is a self-similar pattern at different scales of nature. So if you take a microscopic view, if you take a human view, and you take a pulled back macroscopic view of the same phenomenon, you're going to get the same type of patterning. So I'm looking for the same type of patterning that relates to desert imagery, oceanic imagery, sky imagery, but I'm not trying to make landscape paintings. I mean, we've come along, you know, it's early 21st century, so we have a lot of modalities in which to look at nature that we didn't have when landscape painting was in vogue. So much is processed through computer screens, television sets, looking at airplane windows, microscopic views, telescopic views. So I'm trying to take all that information and condense it down to a painting that is complete into itself, so it doesn't need a reference point outside of itself. I mean, I think that's the power of abstract painting to begin with. It's totally self-contained. And the gestures, the markings, everything is free to be itself. It doesn't need to refer, but there's a slight allusion in this work to something other than itself.
That's interesting you say that, because that again drives home the importance of the variety in this body of work that many abstract painters, you included, have produced bodies of work that present themselves as at least as much as wholes as sums of parts for exhibition purposes. But this work, although it fits the space quite nicely, no one work talks to another, well, with the possible exception of the two on that wall. No one work talks to another as if saying, okay, here, you take the ball. There is a remanifestation of method and thought in each.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I start out with a sort of a completely different color palette in each of these paintings,
right,
which sounds like a simple shift, but it's amazing how you can look at the same imagery in one color palette and it suggests one type of natural phenomenon, and pretty much the same fractal patterning can take place in another one, and you're going to see something totally different. So going into each painting, I have a sort of set of parameters I'm looking for, but as the paint is all flowed onto the surface at once, so each one is done within a very condensed period of time, because I have to complete the painting before the paint dries. That's the big trick. And there's a lot of preparation, sometimes weeks of preparation go into each painting. But then once I've got the color palette worked out, and if you look around the corner, there's a bunch of small paintings. Each one of those paintings, I probably do 3 or 4 or even 5 small paintings before I embark on a large scale painting. And it sort of sets the parameters of different directions, because decisions have to be made. Thousands of decisions have to be made within the first 30 or 40 minutes of painting. The whole thing is wet, and if I don't approach it the right way, it's going to go down a road that I kind of can't bring it back. So there is this very organic moment and this kind of interface between what's happening on the surface of the painting and how I react to it. So it's process driven, but it's very interactive or very proactive with the process.
And it's more, you might say, teleological in that you're not simply exploring the process, you're exploring the result. And in fact, narrowing down possibilities until you come to a result, until you come to, I think you use the word singularity.
Yeah, I mean, I think of each finished painting as a singularity, because I start out with a million different possibilities. And as time elapses, those possibilities get less and less until you get a kind of singular image. that satisfies me on mostly intuitive levels at the time, because there's not a lot of time to make anything other than intuitive decisions. But the more paintings I make, the more I can kind of step back and analyze what it is about a certain painting that works or doesn't work, and then that's all information going into the next painting.
It sounds kind of Zen, you know, weeks of preparation, weeks of contemplation, and then 40 minutes to
Right.
get it right.
Yes.
You test pretty well.
I mean, it's an exciting process because you have to be very present at the time. And because I've spent all this time preparing all this paint, you really have no choice to be. You're heavily invested going in. So it's exciting, but it's very freeing at the same time because there's so many different directions I can push the paint.
At what point in the process do you determine the nature of the surface of the support?
I mean, that's done obviously ahead of time. The panels are lucite, mounted on plywood, curved over a maple concave wood surface. So that's all done prior to actually painting them. And I do each one flat on the ground with a variety of pre-mixed paints in different size containers of different viscosities and different colorations and different amounts, configurations. So there's a kind of mathematical process to it. Everything, I notate everything. So I know exactly what I did to make that painting. If I were to go back and make the painting, it's like snowflakes, it wouldn't be the same, but there's parameters and I could get something within that range. So it's kind of somewhere between applying paint and kind of garage, mad science, garage alchemy. And I keep a lot of notes, and that kind of pushes the process forward. So at least I'm not reinventing the wheel every time I approach one of these paintings.
Right, right. But that's not to say that each of these notations is a recipe for producing.
It's not a recipe for producing a good painting at all, because I can use the same formula and come up with a really shitty painting. So it basically just sets color palette parameters and width of line, things like that. And through the process, these square paintings I started, they don't look square, but all the, they're either these panoramics or the squares. And I started them about 9 months ago. I'd been doing the panoramas for about the last 12 years.
Right.
And I became interested in this square because it was sort of like taking the information from the panoramas and condensing it down, almost taking like a close-up of one part of these paintings. So I feel like they're more abstract. They look more topographical, whereas the panoramas look like you're looking out into space. These feel like you're floating above space, or even in some of the newer ones, I feel like this blue one over here, or this green one on the back wall, where I'm torquing and pushing space in a bunch of different directions simultaneously. We saw this show in New York at the Guggenheim over the summer, which was the Futurist show. And it was really interesting paintings because you were looking at 4 different perspectives simultaneous, looking up, looking down, looking out. So I feel like I took a little bit of that information and really worked it into these recent paintings. But part of the process of these, like if you look at this painting, you see these very fine lines at the top and it gets softer and softer. So that's something that I just discovered through making them. As the paint is coming out, it's blending more and more. The patterning is getting softer. So you get this kind of soft focus in one area and this very distinctive line in another. So it's all pouring the paint and really analyzing what it does and then trying to figure out where to take it next from there.
I get a sense that that the process is something in which you're continually invested and, as you say, continually present, so that it's guiding you and you're guiding it at the same time.
Right. I mean, hopefully when it works right, it's kind of a meeting of many different things, which who knows where all the information is coming from. Some is coming from inside the studio. I feel like some is coming from looking out in nature, and hopefully it's alchemical in the sense that it's a meeting of what's happening in one space with something that's happening in a much larger space. The alchemists were always looking to not just transform base metals into gold, but to transform their own psyche at the same time. And they always felt like if they couldn't if an uninitiated person were to get the same recipe to transform base metals into gold, not only couldn't they do it, but something very terrible would happen to them. But I mean, I feel like this is sort of this process, so don't try it at home. So I feel like this process, there's a transformative aspect to working through it that I feel like my psyche works through different aspects, and hopefully some of that becomes present.
That means you have a lot of meaning, and almost self-interpretation invested in this work as well. You're not afraid to let these things not so much present themselves pictorially to viewers, although that's in the range of possibility as well, but to present themselves pictorially to you in the process of making them.
Right. I mean, I think, again, when it happens best, it's kind of undeterminate in terms of whether I had the idea for this image, or whether the image presented itself, whether I worked it to the idea I wanted, or whether I transformed my idea to fit what the result was. I think all of those things happen simultaneously, which is why it's an interesting process.
Yeah.
It's kind of unlimited.
It's a different interpretation of what Frank Stella said. You know, what you see is what you see. Well, I see, you know, a particular space here. Oh no, now I don't see it anymore.
Right. I mean, I think I want to make something that simultaneously has a lot of reference points to it, yet it's still elusive.
Right.
So you can bring something that you've seen out in the natural world to it. You can bring abstract paintings you've seen before. You can bring all this information to it, and it suggests those things, and yet it can suggest one set of possibilities to one person, and that's just slightly elusive, and it moves over here and it moves over there.
It's fascinating that an abstract practice like this not resist your own much or the audience's associations. That's as a matter of fact, that's always been a problem I've had with the discourse in non-objective painting, that it can't look like anything.
Right.
And people then mistake that for it can't mean anything either. And in fact, it means that much more if it doesn't look like any one thing.
Right. I mean, I think especially, and I don't know if it was by the practitioners or by the critics, but there was a very hard line of sort of New York school abstract painting,
Right.
that it couldn't look like anything. And I think it's hard to make something not look like anything, but even if it does, now we've had 50 or 60 years of that particular type of abstract painting, so now it looks like an abstract painting. So something is always going to be something, but I think the freedom of abstract painting is that the mark, the gesture, the line, the color, it's not beholden to something outside of itself, which I think is important. So it makes a statement, and it's a totality. Whereas when you have a referential painting, there's this discourse going on between what you're seeing and what the thing is you're referring to. It's a very different type of thing. I feel like I'm trying to split the line between those two things.
Right.
So there's a pictorial aspect to it, there's a purely abstract aspect to it. I want it to be a totality, but I want the residue of it to resonate out into the world with natural phenomenon.
Ironically enough, I think one of the aspects of these works, their object quality, the fact that they are surfaces that tend to be concave or convex or emphatically material, adds, in this case, in your case, and especially with this body of work, to their referential aspects, their elusive
right.
aspects.
I mean, I think that's what takes it out of the zone of being purely pictorial, because it's such a physical object. So, you know, abstract painting was mostly being an object, but being a totality. And it didn't want to be a picture of something. And I don't want these to be a picture of something, but I want to enhance the object quality to make the physicality of them very obvious.
Right, I think the piece, RAD, or did you say RAD or RAD?
Right, RAD or RAD.
The piece that hangs
right.
well above our heads, those Those of you more towards the back are able.
Well, I feel like this was sort of a breakthrough. I abandoned canvas about a year ago, and now I'm working on lucite, which is more flexible in terms of how canvas is flexible, but in terms of getting it to adhere to the support, there were some problematic aspects to it. So now I have total freedom to work with the curve in the way I want. And I mean, the curve was to give it this objectivity or objectness, but also to work functionally to enhance some of the qualities of the paint, which are its luminosity and these interference colors that I work with, that as you move around, the colors shift. So the curve is actually enhancing that aspect as well. So there is a functionality to the curve beyond just the mere fact of it existing.
A double functionality, making these paintings objects and making them that much more pictorial, especially because they infer, for various reasons, they infer the presence of a screen, of a visual screen.
Right. Well, I started in film briefly before I ever started painting. So I mean, there was a final sequence in 2001, which I saw at 6 years old at the Cinerama Dome in Hollywood, where they're flying through space and you see this kind of psychedelic landscape of infinite space. And it always really stuck with me in terms of both the surround going this way, entering this space, and there's a horizon, but what's above and what's below, there's almost no difference between what you're seeing, yet you think of them as two different things. What's above is sky, what's below is earth. But I've been in airplanes where you're seeing horizons just out of clouds, clouds below, clouds above, and you get this.
Right.
So that kind of spatial dimension has always really interested me in terms of its power of being able to take you on a journey, if you will. Right. And I want these paintings to kind of take you on a journey.
I guess you could call them cineramic abstraction.
I like it.
but you know, joking only partly, that effect has that ability to create an emphatically recessive space that is still not specific. It is no one place. It is, in fact, not composed of either clouds or water or earth,
right,
or outer space.
It's purely line, and that's something that I feel strongly about. It's not making a referent to something outside itself. It's alluding to it in a roundabout way. And these are, I think of them as spaces because they're spatial dimension. Mm-hmm. So they suggest a space rather than just an object. Right. But I like this tug of war between object and space. And it's one of the things that I'm looking for. Because I think when something is elusive and it's more complex, you're seeing it fresher than something that you can easily categorize. Yeah.
When you say it's allusive, A-L-L, as opposed to elusive, E-L.
Well, I think they're slightly elusive, but they're definitely allusive to nature and natural phenomenon. And I definitely distinctly want that, but I want them also to be slightly elusive, because I feel like when something becomes overly determined, you lose the magic along the way.
So they present themselves at once as non-objective, that is, without any reference to the scene world, to abstract, in other words, alluding to the scene world, and pictorial, that is, representing the scene world, which is pretty radical range.
I hope so. And I mean, I think this type of object paint, I'll go back to the curve one more time. I think the other thing that intrigues me about the curve, it refers to the curvature of space. So also the curvature of the earth, the curvature of space. So it has that illusion as well as a sculptural quality.
So if we talk about the content of this work, its meaning, quote unquote, we have to talk about all these things to which it alludes, as opposed to anything that it inheres. It does not contain meaning. It indicates
or invokes,
possibilities.
Maybe invokes.
Invokes.
But more than meaning, I just wanted to invoke experience, an experience of seeing light and color, light and motion and color that affects you in some sort of psychological way or some kind of chemical way, if you will.
If that be the case, then do you feel an affinity with light and space practice?
I mean, I definitely do. I think I grew up around it. It was one of the aspects of art that I grew up around. So without a doubt, I think when I moved back to California from New York, I'd been in New York nearly 20 years in the 80s and 90s. And I was making these dark black and white paintings. So I think when I moved back to LA and saw light in my studio for the first time, I kind of understood light and space a little more. And it's interesting, that's when I started working with curve. And it wasn't until after I made some curved paintings that I felt a stronger connection. So I think there was that one moment when I was making very reduced pearlescent white paintings that I felt a real affinity. But I kind of brought in, it was sort of like starting over when I made these paintings, but then I built them more and more complex. And I think these paintings, though there's aspects of that movement, it's very distinctively different in the sense that they were trying to create this light. There was never motion, and there was never kind of, there was never line, there was never motion, and it was kind of a rejection of painting, if you will. And I feel like I've taken information, but light has been an interest from light and space, but also from Venetian Renaissance painting. I think there's a lot of periods of art that deal with light and focus on light. French Impressionism, so Turner. So I think you've got this constant, I mean, it's one of the constants. To me, the challenge is to condense it back into a painting. And I think so much art of the 70s and 80s was taking art out in the world, from land art, which I love too. But I want to take that information, somehow work it back in to a simple object.
That's pretty ambitious, and I think that level of ambition shows has shown in most of your bodies of work, but especially in this one, given its variety. And again, it speaks to that distinction that the Europeans make between the abstract and the non-objective. But also, it also speaks to marks made without mark making.
Yeah, I'm ending up with what looks like mark and gesture, but it's not made in a conventional way through just moving an arm. So when you're seeing these fluid lines, they're actually done. It's the way the paint is wanting to flow. It's kind of gravity dispersion. It's aquatic interference between different viscosities. So there's this scientific aspect that you're seeing to something that looks very primal or primitive even in terms of mark making.
Right.
But it's got these echoes in nature.
Right. Right. It's mark making, but not by humans.
Right. I mean, there's a human director,
right,
but there's not a human specific gesture maker, though I have become pretty good at controlling how these lines move in space.
Which gets back to the issue of fractals and the natural aspect of fractals as opposed to the mathematical. If we look at fractals mathematically, we're understanding them from a human analysis. If we look at them naturally, the way that fractals occur in nature, whether determining the structure of a plant or the structure of a coastline, then we have nothing to do with that, and it's a matter of feeling acted upon.
Right. I mean, these are both simultaneously, I think.
Right.
I'm acting upon this natural patterning, and the natural patterning is occurring. So there's this back and forth dialogue, and hopefully it's not just about my experience with it, it's the viewer can bring something when they're looking at it. You know, it goes back and forth. We have a whole history, 100 years plus, of looking at abstract paintings, which I think has really enhanced the way we see the world. So it's sort of art imitating nature, imitating art. And I think that I'm trying to bring back, I'm taking the language of abstract painting, but almost using it as building blocks to recreate the universe on some level.
To recreating recreating the making of remaking the shaping of the universe, or the perception of the universe?
I mean, a little bit of both. Hopefully it is a tweak in perception. I think I'm trying to take aspects of nature and condense them in a way that you see the interrelationships between phenomenon and nature. For some reason, it's always a very fulfilling moment if you're driving down the coast and you see the sunset, and for one moment, sky and ocean become one phenomenon rather than two. It's like the marriage of these two things. And I think that that's something that I pick up a lot. It's just a moving kind of moment. So when you can take different aspects of nature and condense them into one image where they connect, I feel like you feel connected to that as well as these two things connecting to each other.